Hello and welcome to another theological episode of the Schaufler Lab videocast. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Frida Mannerfelt as our guest speaker today. My name is Marie Briese. I am writing my dissertation in theology about the question of the intersections between right-wing populists and Christian fundamentalists on Instagram. I'm working at the Schaufler Lab at TU Dresden. And if you need more information about the Schaufler Lab at TU Dresden, you will find them in our former videocasts, which I can highly recommend, and on our website. To keep it short, the Schaufler Lab researches the socio-technical and cultural synthesis of new realities under the guiding theme of data worlds. This brings me back to you, Frida, because one of your research interests are digital religion and theology. Dr. Frida Mannerfelt is an associate professor in practical theology at the Center of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Lund. She works as a postdoctoral researcher in the project Scripture and Secularism on the topics of Bible, culture, and politics. She examines how religious actors' Bible use in public debate contributes to form and reform notions of the secular. Besides that, you focus on the topic of preaching and liturgy under the influence of digital culture, digital environments, or digital tools, including AI. And what I think is very interesting and also important to mention is your focus on Sweden and why this focus can be relevant for researching questions of digital theology and digital religion in Western countries in general. Sweden is one of the world's most digitalized countries, and the Church of Sweden is one of the world's wealthiest churches. So for these reasons, the Church of Sweden can hire experts for technology and communication. And given these extremes, the Swedish context could illustrate the future or even the present socio-technical developments. Therefore, I'm very thankful for your time and insights in the Christian data world of Sweden. Frida, you can start your presentation, and afterwards we will have a discussion on data, AI, church, practice, and beliefs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marie, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. You've asked me to say a little bit about what I'm currently working on. So I'm part of a Scripture Secularism project, as you said, biblical influences in and on modern publics. It's a 5-year multidisciplinary research project based at Lund University. We are 5 researchers, and actually a 6th one is incoming. It's Dr. Hannah Sturman, who's the PI, Hebrew Bible scholar. Has done some really interesting work in the intersection of biblical studies, biblical reception studies. It's also Dr. Hanna Liljefors, Dr. Joel Kulin, and our PhD, Samuel Barry-Oller. And also incoming is Dr. Elizabeth Ortego-Torres, who's a scholar of law. We are together examining some of those ideas about the Bible and the secular that are circulated as truth or important narratives in public debate today. One of them being that the Bible is increasingly irrelevant in the modern world, or that another one is that there is some sort of connection between the secular and the Bible. Sometimes we hear these in political debates. I'm sure that, Marie, you've heard this many times in your own work, that politicians or cultural celebrities praising our secular democratic Europe or West on Christian and biblical grounds, and then in contrast to the religious other from outside of the West who is against democracy and equality and so on. So in different ways we are examining how these ideas came about and what their consequences are, for example, political and cultural debate and legislation. So this is what the webpage says. Ultimately, the project seeks to uncover the ways in which the continued role of the Bible in the modern world is important for understanding constructions of the West as normative for distinctions between religion and politics. So my task in this project relates to two things that make my researcher's heart beat faster. And the first is narratives, and the second is media. Talking about the first. Narratives shape meaning, and they are connected to identity and power. The stories we tell about ourselves and our communities, they shape, create, sustain worlds, which is what we'll be talking about a bit today, later on. Some work on historical narratives and life stories of, for example, the first women to be ordained. And this is a monograph that is published today, so yay. But in this project, I am looking into how perceptions of secularity in Swedish public debate changes over time through continuous negotiations. And these narratives are, of course, really important because they are crucial in the secularization process as societies create legislation and policies. And that is why it's so interesting to see how they have developed over time. Just to make sure, for those of us who are not sociologists, I'm doing this so I can hear that I'm clear about the distinctions here. Secularism, as part of the theme for our project, is the political and ideological notion that there should be a divide. So it's more like the abstract ideas in our project. Secularization, when we talk about that, we talk about the societal processes of change, for example, differentialization, when you divide society into spheres, which is religious and non-religious, and then also secularity, where we are very much informed and inspired by the Multiple Secularities project that is in Leipzig, or based in Leipzig a few years ago, where secularity is, it's the cultural meanings that underlie forms and arrangement of differentiation between religion and other social spheres. Secularity also encompasses these taken for granted forms, distinctions, narratives between the religious and the non-religious. And it's also understood as a result of social conflict or negotiation processes. These boundaries, what is secular and religious, are continuously redrawn. As I said, the Multiple Secularities project, Volratsa and Burchat here were part of that project, and they pointed out that there's not just one secularity. There are variations across time, space, in how the religious and secular divide is understood and justified. And this is, of course, why it is so very interesting to see how these have developed over time in a country that is not only one of the most digitalized countries in the world with one of the wealthiest churches, it's also a country that is often described as one of the most secularized. And I will be looking into public debates in the 1950s, 1970s, 1990s, and 2010s. And in this project, I also explore which biblical assemblages that are associated with these various changing perceptions of secularity. Because there are not just multiple secularities, there are multiple Bibles out there too, comprised of, certain biblical verses, understandings of what the Bible is, how it should be interpreted, and so on. And Hannah Sturman, our PI, has done some really interesting and important work in this field, inspired by Deleuze and Guattari on biblical assemblages and how they underpin political debate, for example. And the second thing that makes my researcher's heart go very fast, as I said, is media. And I suspect that that is why I've been invited to come here, because I'm looking into perception of secularity in the media. And here in this project, it is old media, newspapers. And here I use mediatization theory to discuss how the media becomes an institution of its own and kind of replaces religious institutions as the site for public debate over what religion and non-religion are. In this Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and so on, with their particular conditions of these old majority state churches that are very wealthy. This way of framing the processes of change is especially fitting. And furthermore, as religion becomes mediatized, media logic decides which topics to cover, how they are presented, and by whom. And this, of course, then affects the perception of secularity, religion, and also the biblical assemblages. I'm also indebted here to the work of my colleague Hanna Liljefors, who has done some really interesting work on a concept she calls the mediatized Bible. Since there are media scholars present here, I just want to point out that this is a non-media-centric approach, talking about media as sort of a layer part of what is happening here. Media is part of it, not the sole explanation of everything, and not downplayed as insignificant, but seen as a contributing actor. So in this project, I work with old media, but most of my research has involved digital media, various kind. As Marie said, I'm a practical theologian, so specialized in Christian churches. So I've done work on churches and digital culture, digital theology, digital mediated religious practices. And now as part of a biblical reception research project, interested in the use of Bibles in, well, contemporary culture, modern culture, secularized culture. It's also, of course, been natural to explore things like Bibles and digital culture and how AI is used in biblical interpretation, for example, by preachers. So I'm going to stop there and give the word back to you, Marie, because now we are moving into an interesting conversation, I think.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it made a very good start for a discussion. And also the narratives and the media part are linked to what we're going to talk about now, because narratives play an important role in how we perceive the Bible or Christianity in digital culture. Yeah, I have some questions prepared on faith communication through digital media. I'm very interested in which role digital technologies play in the communication and also the perception of the Christian religion. Maybe the narratives come into play already there.
I think there are good reasons to describe our culture as a digital culture, particularly here in the Northwest part of the world. Technologies are entangled in our way of existing in the world. They are entangled in the way we communicate, an intrinsic part of how we are social, how we construct and keep society and communities together. And that means, I think, that on a general level, religion, particularly, as I said, here in context that both you and I are in, all religion is in a sense digital, because digital technology is part of everything, also how religion is practiced. So in a way, it shapes religion, but also often shaped by religion. But Christian communities or Christianity can be very many things. There are many different churches, billions of practitioners across the world, various local contexts, which sets the conditions. So, of course, they all in some way live in a digital culture, and they all do in some way some sort of adoption, and rejection, as we usually call it, but to a very big variety of degrees. There's an excellent study out now by Stefan Gelfgren, a Swedish scholar. Why do Christian churches build congregations online? Where he compares three religious Christian communities in Sweden. One Pentecostal, more of the charismatic tradition. One Lutheran, the majority church of Sweden. And also Laestadianism, which is a very conservative revival movement, very old, which is not always very happy about new technology. And it becomes very clear from his studies and his comparison of these three communities or churches that can vary to a very great degree. So technologies can play a big role in the communication and the perception of the Christian religion. But then again, if you ask the Laestadianist church, they would say, well, we reject it as much as we possibly can.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think we come back to denominations and how they use digital tools in very different ways later on. I'm also wondering, do you witness a connection between digital technologies being used in religious contexts and the politicization of the Bible, or maybe the secularization?
Well, this is an excellent question. Not very easy to answer short and concise, but well, according to mediatization theory, you could say that there is a connection between mediatization and secularization and politicization of religion, or the Bible for that matter. It's not related to religious context in particular, but to the mediatization of the whole society. Not that media causes secularization in a simple way, but because changes in the media system kind of reshape how religion is communicated, practiced, and understood. So as I said, mediatization of religion means that media take over functions once held by religious institutions. Media systems becomes the primary source of knowledge, moral discourse, identity formation, public debate on religion, roles that, well, churches historically dominated, at least in the Scandinavian countries. And as I said before, mediatization of religion also means that religion is shaped by media logic. So the content, the form, actors involved. And when religion adapts to media logics, there are several tendencies that can appear. It contributes to personalization, dramatization, where religious rituals are understood as events or even entertainment. It could contribute to commercialization and also secularizing tendencies too. Not as in less religion, but less institutionalized religion. For example, digital media could be said to weaken the authority of religious leaders and give more space, as you know from your own research. Media actors gain authority.
Yes.
And also part of media logic is that it's contrasts and conflicts. You want short, clear, straight yes versus straight no answers. You have protagonists, antagonists, and so on. So there are not much room for nuances, which means that religion in this environment is often framed as political conflict. Well, Christian Europe versus Muslim world, and so on. So the mediatization of religion tends to lead to banal religion, simplified religion that is disconnected from religious institutions. And instead, well, it's up for grabs. So it becomes part of culture, functioning as symbols, which leaves them open to cultural, political appropriation. Mia Lövheim here in Sweden, Linnea Jensdotter have done some really interesting work on how the concept of banal religion can be used to highlight how implicit understandings of religion and national identity kind of becomes intertwined and then is used in political debate. And also Jens Dotter, together with Hanna Liljefors from my research team, has developed this in a really interesting analysis of how the Bible is employed in political debate in Sweden, in Swedish Parliament. And they found a very banal Bible, sort of a national common denominator that is used rhetorically, in contrast to often to a very hot or problematic Quran. So there are connections between digital media, politicization of religion or the Bible, and also secularization, according to this theory. Very long answer to a short but excellent question.
Thank you for answering the question. I think, yeah, there are a lot of important things that you mention, and it also leads me to think about pros and cons of digital media and religion. So, which challenges and which opportunities do you see in the use of AI, especially, and digital technologies in the context of sermons?
Since I'm interested in media also in a historical perspective, this becomes very clear. Every time new technology is involved in sermon preparation or in doing theology, it raises the same questions, often centered on authenticity and generative AI, of course, no exception. You can find an abundance of lists of potential challenges and opportunities that rehearse the same argument, as you can see throughout history. One of my favorite examples is Clement of Alexandria, who in his Stromata from the 2nd century, in his introduction, he has to defend his use of this new technology, this new media, which is called a book. And you can see the same list here. He states that, well, it's very beneficial to use this new technology for storing and also for disseminating important knowledge. It's good for the mission, not least. You can see that opponents are using it. So it's important that Christians also use this new technology. And also, of course, well, this new technology is here to stay. So we better get used to it. And then he also rehearsed, of course, the arguments of his critics, who says that, well, is the message really authentic if we use this new technology? Points out that when we use new technology, it might exclude people who are not very good or able to use this new technology. And also the classic old argument, Jesus didn't do it. He didn't write any books, so why should we? And when you see look into the challenges, opportunities that people raise around the use of AI, digital technologies in context of sermons, you can see that it's the same arguments that keep coming back.
Okay, that's very interesting. I didn't know that before, but yeah, as you said, it's always repeating itself. Yeah. Maybe the most important question or the main question in my head is what kind of beliefs are there in the perception of data-driven technologies like AI? And how do they compare to religious believing?
Ah, yes. Well, this is really an interesting question, and I'm glad that you brought it into the conversation here. You can see the same patterns throughout history here as well, that there are, well, both utopian and dystopian narratives about the new technology, which tend to resonate or sometimes even rhyme with religious hopes and fears. And because we live in secularized times, perhaps the connection to religious narratives are not as clear as in older times or throughout history, but you can still see how they resonate. And particularly about the what if technology, the idea of artificial general intelligence, that AI will someday actually become conscious. Someone who has done great work here is Beth Singler. Of course, I assume most of you have heard about her work, but she said quite early that our modes of thinking about AI is very often implicitly religious. And also interestingly, she asks, might this be a pushback against the secularization thesis? But that's a different discussion.
Yeah.
And she points out that these narratives about AI are often very theistic. AI is described as omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, just like a deity would be. And then, of course, the narratives differ whether or not this omnipotent thing is benevolent or malevolent. And when you look at the more dystopian versions, it's apocalyptic visions. Here in Lund, we now have an interesting research project called the End of the World Project. Cool name.
Yes.
And they are looking into how apocalyptic imaginary is used in history, but also today in contemporary culture and politics, how it shapes historiography, legal political thinking, populist rhetoric, but also reporting the narratives about AI. So absolutely apocalyptic visions. You have eschatology, Christian eschatology, and it resonates with overtones of that. Sometimes it is a catastrophic end of the world, but sometimes it is the end of the world in a positive sense, because now something good is going to happen. And that brings us over to the more utopian narratives, where AI is seen as, well, the salvation of humankind. You have messianic hopes of health or freedom from suffering, even death, and so on. So absolutely, you can see that there are beliefs in AI that are quite similar to religious beliefs, replacing them or kind of including AI in their religious narratives about salvation or the end of the world. Bitzinger says that we need to be very careful about the narratives that we tell about AI, because they tend to shape what we think is possible, which, as in the case of our perceptions about secularity, well, our narratives, they shape how we construe our society, what legislations, what policies we make, and also, what we think we can do. The Swedish debate here, I don't know what it's like in Germany, perhaps you can say something about that. We can see that we have the same patterns. Of course, if we look into how the churches are talking about this, I would say that the Swedish context leans more towards the dystopian version, very critical to AI, maybe not alarmist, like this is the end of the world, AI is going to kill us all eventually, but very critical. But then again, I think in your question, there are also people who turn to AI in their religious practices for pastoral care, having conversation about existential questions. And you can see in the few empirical studies that has been done that people sometimes think that they in some way talk to God. Not that the AI is a God in itself, but God can speak through the AI, through His Holy Spirit, just as God can speak through anything to us.
Oh, that's very interesting. And you made a study to examine preachers' AI use. Get a
Mm.
bit more concrete now. Um, how would you describe the relationship between the preachers and ChatGPT? I think that was the AI tool they used the most.
Mm.
It be characterized as belief, faith, trust, or rejection, demonization, or something else? And what biblical metaphors are used to characterize ChatGPT and yeah, other AI tools like ChatGPT?
Mm. Well, these preachers were quite pragmatic. They saw it as a tool. So they did not personalize it or saw it as God or God speaking through it. Their approach to the large language models were quite consistent with the few other studies of clergy use of these kind of tools. You can use it if it promotes theological values such as community, pastoral care, and mission, and so on. But we could see that they tended to overestimate and also simultaneously underestimate it as a tool. They underestimated what the tool could be used for,
Mm.
and also overestimated its capacity to understand their prompts or their instructions. For example, most of them were very open-ended. One of them asked for, could you please say something about the theology of the baptism? And then the informant was very disappointed when the answer was not properly Lutheran or tailored to her Swedish context. Um, these preachers that were part of this project did not talk so much about how they understood the AI theologically. But then again, the researcher didn't ask them about that question. But there are very interesting work out there. I mean, you can mention in Lund, we have Leshen Geshoya, a Hebrew Bible scholar, who's done some really interesting rereadings of Genesis chapter 2 and 3, the Eden story, in light of AI discourse, where she discusses sin and evil and good. But you also have Peter Phillips, also biblical scholar, but also digital theologian, who sometimes draw on the story about Biliam's donkey, if you
Mm.
remember it from the old, Hebrew Bible, where God speaks through donkey.
Yes.
And the idea that God can speak through anything in creation if God so wishes. Same idea that underpins another theological theme or a metaphor that is commonly used, I think, which is the notion that as if we do not speak, the stones will. So
Ah,
God can speak through material things, or perhaps an AI, if we listen carefully, and especially if humans are not doing good enough work. Also, I think I've heard theologians use the idea of tokens in relation to the parable of the talents.
mm.
Um, if you use your tokens, you should use them wisely, because then you will get twice back. And we all know what happened to the person who took his talent or his token and buried in the ground, afraid of using it. So there are a lot of interesting theological concepts out there that I think could be helpful. But
Mm.
also, I think that AI sometimes also help us to question our common theological concepts that we just use. Uh, one of the most commonly used theological concepts in relation to AI is the imago Dei. Yeah, bit
Mm.
cliche, but it's used, and I think it's theologians have done some really interesting work in developing kind of pushing what this theological concept can mean in light of the existence of large language models and possibly AGI. But also, I think, to me, the most interesting part of that is when the theologians who question the use of that concept at all, who say that, well, maybe this is our sign to lose the idea of humans as imago Dei and start looking at the other creation story where human is pictured as created from dust, from earth, as part of the rest of creation. And perhaps it's more fruitful in our time to think about humans as made of earth, part of creations, rather than human as standing separate from creation as the image of God. So a lot of interesting work is done.
Yes.
Yeah. What's like in Germany? Do you have any interesting theological concepts that has become important?
I think you're more creative in Sweden than we are in Germany. Or I have to admit that I don't know all the theological ways to think about AI, but I think we have yeah, a lot of material, metaphors, narratives that we can use to think of AI, and even in an ethical way. As you just said, not to think about humans as imago Dei, but rather as part of the creation. Yeah, I think that's very important to think of, yeah, what AI or the use of AI does to the whole creation, and not only, yeah, to preachers or congregations.
Or students and scholars.
Yes, yes, that's yeah, also very important. In your survey, you noticed a correlation between a very positive attitude towards AI and the evangelical background of the preachers. That is one thing that I also notice a lot, especially when it comes to mission. You can reach out to more people with the help of technology. Can you briefly explain where this comes from? And do you see any broader connections between evangelical preachers and the operators of LLMs and political or religious interests?
I think you could say that there is some sort of connection. It's very well known that evangelicals are more prone or more positive towards technology and media overall. As you said, it has something to do with their understanding of what church is and church should do. And you can see in much of the research how important theological and ecclesiological understandings are for how religious practitioners do this adoption, or rejection thing. It's the narratives, the theological narratives, or the theological imaginations are very important. And since evangelical churches tend to emphasize mission, church growth, they are more prone to use media, more positive, and church traditions that emphasize real presence, sacraments, incarnation, usually more cautious. But it's interesting to see that the general positive attitude among evangelicals towards technology, and also I think the fact that the Bible is important part, is central to evangelical spirituality. It seems to affect what kind of technology that is available. I don't know if you have read John Dyer's interesting book, came out just a few years ago, People of the Screen, How Evangelicals Created the Digital Bible and How It Shapes Their Reading of Scripture, where he shows or argues quite convincingly, I think, that evangelical entrepreneurs, evangelical coders create much of the Bible software that has been used early on and also now, which shapes how Christians from all traditions meet digital Bibles. Very interesting. And also really report from a group of scholars from Cambridge that come out last week just about Bible apps also showed that the same tendencies. It's the people who are taking the initiative to create software are people from an evangelical background. They looked specifically at that project into Bible apps powered by large language models, where you can actually chat to them to ask questions about the Bible. But it also looked into ChatGPT as a reference point to compare, and maybe it showed, they say, maybe a slight theological bias towards evangelical theology too. But I know there were any studies of the political implications of this. Maybe if people who are watching or listening could contribute with links to that. Otherwise, I think someone should really do that.
Yes, I totally agree. I read in your article that some of the preachers that said that they use ChatGPT to find examples that they can use to relate the sermon to the audience. And they usually do this with the help of different elements of everyday life. But now they start using ChatGPT and they draw inspiration for connecting with their listeners' world from the data world of LLMs, including evangelical operators or the training data, biases, interests of, or political interests, and so on. How do you think about this? And do you see any hints in your material about the preachers being aware of the problems behind this or the risks they buy in unknowingly or unconsciously?
Well, some of them did indeed report that they had tried to get inspiration on how to connect to the listener's world by asking a large language model. But I think the important word here is inspiration, because they use their own experience and knowledge of their listener's situation to determine whether or not the large language model's suggestions were relevant. And you could also see in the sermons that they produced that they used their own words to elaborate on what everyday life actually meant in their context. So they didn't just, take the LLM suggestions, put them in the sermon, and spoke about that. And in that way, they also acted in the same way as clergy in America in an interesting study by Cheong and Liu, because they did not give up their authority or interpretative agency. They used them for brainstorming, or to use the proper terms, cognitive stimulation and not cognitive offload. And I think it is important to keep in mind that these preachers, as most preachers are trained to interpret and discern. And in some way, if we're using the larger historical perspective, isn't the same kind of issues that arise when you read a sermon for inspiration, when you prepare a sermon from, let's say, Augustine. The context of 4th century North Africa, Bishop of Hippo, is very different from our. And some of Augustine's view on women, for example, is and the religious other, they are horrible. But you can still use it for inspiration because as a preacher, you are trained to interpret, pick out, this is meaningful, this is not meaningful. So with their pastoral and theological skills, they can discern the gold from the dross.
I think that's very important what you just said, that preachers have what it takes to reflect on the answers that maybe ChatGPT gives them to religious question. And we are slowly but surely coming to the end of our moderated discussions, but I have two questions left, and they fit perfectly to what you just said. And maybe they're also the most important questions because they can help us to transfer our knowledge into the broader public. And when it comes to new technologies with so many myths surrounding them, I think we as scholars have a responsibility to educate the users of ChatGPT and so on. So, yeah, you conclude that all the preachers use ChatGPT in a responsible and reflected way. But not only trained theologians use ChatGPT to answer questions regarding religion. Do we need to train the broader public, theologically informed AI literacy? And how could we do this?
Yes, we need to do that. I often return to an excellent little book by Sabrina Müller, who's a professor of practical theology in Bonn. I only read the English version. I'm sure there's a German one, but the English title is Live Theology, Impulses for a Pastoral Theology of Empowerment. And in that, one of the chapters of that book, she discusses how a digital culture creates new spaces for people, lay people, to actually preach, for example, through social media and so on. And as you have shown in your research, Maria, this can be done with, well, let's say various qualities. And therefore, Miller says that it's pivotal that trained theologians teach lay people how to interpret the Bible or to represent Christian faith in a responsible and faithful way. So this can be done as part of pastoral strategy, but of course, it's also very important in academia that scholars, we as teachers, teach students how to use these tools in their, well, scholarly work.
Yeah.
We have just had a few really interesting studies from Lund University, which shows that these are skills that our alumni says we need to teach the students, and the students also ask for it all across the faculties, not just theological. So absolutely, I think we need to teach people, train the public in AI literacy, also, of course, theologically informed. Absolutely. But then again, the question arises, what about the people that we do not yet reach? In Sweden, we have had a large study about the use of AI among younger people, children. And you can see how they ask not just, how can I do the schoolwork, but they also ask existential questions. So how do you reach people that are not students at the theological faculty or people who are in religious communities, but still want to use AI for theological questions or existential questions, or, well, just as a friend in your pocket that you can talk to everything about.
Yeah, maybe for these cases, we need like a disclaimer. And that's my last little bit fun question. If ChatGPT had a disclaimer when a religious question is asked, what should it be?
Such an excellent question. I thought about it a lot as I prepared for this discussion. I said, would it be a disclaimer like the one I have? Well, this is my Bible, and I have a small disclaimer on the inside of it, which says that basically warning, this is a Bible. Application or interpretation of this text could seriously harm people. Which is kind of reminder of responsibility that follows with the claim to be, well, as a preacher, you are supposed to speak the word of God. And that is a big responsibility. But so could we use something like that for AI? Well, disclaimers that remind users to think for themselves, and they are already there, I think. So if I were to wish for something, I think I would rather add some sort of disclaimer or even information about how much energy would it take to process my request, uh, for me to think twice. Is it really necessary with another cat video, or just responsible, ethical thinking about how, in which situation that it's necessary, really necessary to use these kind of tools.
Mhm. Yes, I totally agree with that.
Mm. And I'm
Yes.
also very curious, what would your answer to the last question be?
Oh, I think the most important thing to me is also
Mm.
to think about the consequences for the environment and for all the people that are included in the process of training the data and marking all the harmful content and everything like that. Yeah. And when it comes to the religious part, yeah. It's a hard question that I came up with, I have to admit. Um, yeah, I think I would write something like that religion also is not just the conversation between you and data, but
Mm.
it really lives from connecting with other people and connecting with God, and that LLMs do not really help you with connecting with other people and yourself and God. Maybe that would be my answer very
Mm.
spontaneously.
Thank you.
Frida, thank you for your time and your kindness, your insights, and your research. I really appreciate your work and yeah, thank you for joining us today. I think we all learned a lot.